to the final time block of the Rare Plants session. I hope all of you had nice lunches and you're ready to take your naps. Just kidding, just kidding. These talks are going to be so awesome that you will barely be able to contain yourselves. Anyway, I introduce our first speaker, who is Mare Nazaire, who is from my own home institution at Rancho Botanic. And Mare came to Rancho with a PhD, and she has studied Mertensia systematics and biogeography, and she's our collection manager at RSA. So she's going to talk to us about the importance of herbarium collecting as it pertains to rarity.
I'm probably going to tell you a few things that you already know, but probably need to be reminded of. Over the last year, there have been a number of publications regarding the debate of whether collecting specimens caused extinction for some species. Now, although this is not a new debate, I thought that this provided an opportunity to talk about why collections are important and invaluable to science. Coupled with the fact that many institutions seem to be losing support for maintaining their collections only reinforces why it's important to talk about this issue. I'm probably preaching to the choir here, because all of you are botanists and biologists, but it is our responsibility to teach our students, our colleagues, administrators, government agencies, and those who make decisions about policy and management the importance of collections to advancing our research and for informing our conservation and management decisions. So I'll talk about why plant collecting is important. But first I want to ask, how many of you use specimens in your research? Could you raise your hands? And how many of you collect specimens for your research? All of you should be raising your hands. More collecting is needed. In a time when digitization is increasing and we have greater accessibility to those specimens through databases, through web portals and aggregators, there might be this assumption that digitization could replace herbarium specimens. But on the contrary, that is our digitized specimens should be seen as supplemental to herbarium specimens. Collections are an essential tool and the basic infrastructure for advancing the discipline of all of our plant sciences. There are over 200 talks here, so there are well over 200 reasons why we use specimens in collections. And one of those, for obvious reasons, is identification. Only by having specimens can we be certain of the identity of the species. Herbarium specimens provide a rich source of distributional data that can be used to understand habitat requirements and how diversity changes. Can also be used to understand introductions of invasive and non-native species. Without continued collecting, our knowledge about local and regional diversity can become outdated. Moreover, specimens can be used in distribution modeling to understand, predict, and monitor the effects of climate change. Specimens are a prerequisite for describing species that are new to science. I think between TJM1 and TJM2, we've had a 5.4 increase in the number of species. And I know that includes changing taxonomy, but some of those are species that are new to science. Moreover, specimens are the source. They are the material that we use when our species concepts change. And of course, specimens are used for understanding patterns of phenology. This is one example from Everett et al., who looked at New England deciduous forests and leaf-out times, and found that leaf-out dates were occurring 2.7 days earlier with every degree Celsius increase in mean April temperature. And that data was extrapolated from herbarium specimens. And of course, we have increasing use of specimens for understanding evolutionary relationships, working on phylogenies. I think in the last 5 years, I've seen the number of destructive sampling requests double at RSA, which is quite remarkable. We do depend on specimens to understand evolutionary relationships, and also to test hypotheses about ancestral areas and geographic radiations. This is actually an example from my own work looking at Mertensia and looking at geographic radiations in Western North America. All of that could not be done without using specimens from my own collections as well as others. This is a plug for the California Plant Phylogeny Working Group, who are using citizen scientists to collect target plants to understand phylogenetic diversity. And here is another reason why we need specimens. So our ability to make informed land management and conservation decisions, especially for rare plants, is dependent on collections and being able to collect over time. This becomes increasingly critical as anthropogenic threats, habitat loss, and the potential effects of climate change our diversity. Specimens play a major role in making research repeatable and thus an empirical science. Even if specimens do nothing more than document a particular species at a particular place at a particular time, it is still valuable. In essence, no voucher, no data. So collect your specimens. So I was going to just take a look at some of the patterns of decline and areas that have been under-collected in the United States. This is an older paper, and you probably are all familiar with this paper from Prather et al. That looked at regional patterns of specimen accumulation using 71 herbaria from 9 exemplar genera, and this is plotted by decade. And what we see here is that most regions have this peak right around the 30s when highways were making access to those new sites more accessible, with the exception of the mountain region where the Rocky Mountain Herbarium is located. They have their graduate program, which is actively doing floristic work. When we look at Western United States, although the U.S. is one of the best known floras in the world, there are still large areas that are yet to be fully explored. And this is from Dean Taylor's work looking at specimen density in the United States. And we can see that Nevada is kind of like the last botanical frontier, essentially. That's why I want to go work there. And then, if you're not familiar with this, this is from the Consortium of California Herbaria. This is a map displaying all of the records that have latitude and longitude coordinates. But you can still see that there are still large areas that are these black holes, yet areas that have yet to be explored and collected. When we plot that CCH data by records per square kilometer and by county, we see that San Francisco County by far exceeds any other, probably because it's such a small square kilometer size. But almost 60% of the counties in California have less than 5 specimens per square kilometer. So what about collecting rare plants? California has more than 6,500 native taxa, of which more than 2,300 are listed as rare by the CNPS. The California Natural Diversity Database, as of December 2014, listed nearly 38,000 occurrences for specific locations. When we look at when they were last seen, we see that 29% were last seen from the present day up to 9 years ago, 56% were last seen from 10 to 49 years ago, and 15% were last seen from 50 or more years ago. And I think that the CNPS Rare Plant Treasure Hunt is a great effort for trying to find and relocate a lot of these species locations. Also, with all of these, we only have 49% that have at least one voucher specimen. That means that 51% are rumors. So more collecting. You might be familiar with this. This was from Nick Jensen and Shannon Still's work. Shannon presented it on the first day. It's threats tracked by the CNDDB. Where does collecting fall on this graph? Right here at 117 occurrences, or 0.04%. And when I looked at those records a little more closely, I found that what kind of collecting was it? 56% were not specified. It was general collecting. 21% were recreational hikers or flower pickers were actually listed on there. 20% were poachers or for horticultural purposes, and only 3% were student and or research. Now, collecting or over-collecting by botanists is not new. In the early 20th and 19th centuries, botanists would frequently go out and collect and actually have catalogs where they would sell their specimens. This is an example from Marcus E. Jones, 1884, Flora of Arizona. And he notes, this list contains an unusually large number of new and rare species, most of which are still to be described. So you could have them in your collection. He was selling his collections to private collectors and herbaria. This is another example where Mrs. R.M. Austin was selling live plants in lots of 100 and 1,000. So it would be interesting to see what species may have become rare because of her collecting. There are some examples in the present day. This is from 1994, where there was over-collecting in New Zealand for the New Zealand flora. But generally, I think that we've come a long way from this indiscriminate collecting. I think more of a problem is poaching. Collection or over-collection can magnify the risk of extinction, especially for small and isolated populations, already suffering the effects of other kinds of threats, such as grazing, habitat loss. But I would say that vouchers of rare plants are incredibly valuable for informing our conservation management decisions and for devising conservation strategies to reduce species loss. And so it would seem that if collecting was done responsibly, it could not do more damage than some of the threats that are already out there. So I looked at a number of guidelines, including the California Native Plant Society guidelines for collecting rare plants, but this is a compiled list of guidelines. I think as botanists and biologists, it is our responsibility to impart this knowledge to others, because I think responsible collecting is what we need. So determine whether the study of a rare plant is central to your research. Make sure that it generates data that's relative to a greater understanding of the biology of that species, and that it informs effective management and conservation of that species. Conduct prior research. perform literature and online searches, examine federal and endangered species recovery plans, and investigate several species as potential backups, and also use herbaria to examine specimens. Select your species wisely, make sure that populations are abundant and have ease of access to sites and that are protected from vandals, and make sure that it meets your research needs. For example, is it the right flower size or fruit size? And of course, obtain all the necessary permits and permissions, and always carry your permit. And design minimally invasive experiments. Select observational studies over manipulations. Minimize the number of visits you make to the site. Mark your plants inconspicuously and unobtrusively. And minimize the potential for introducing novel genotypes. And be conservative in the collection of your plant material. There are varying guidelines for this. The New England Wildflower Society suggests collections should impact fewer than 10% of the population. Other wildlife native plant societies suggest no more than 5%, or the 1 in 20 rule. Our permit with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service indicates 5 individuals or 2% of the population, whichever is smaller for annual plants. And for herbaceous perennials, shrubs, and trees, 2% of the population. But I would say that there's no right answer here. You really need to ask yourself how large or small that population is. Is it outcrossing or selfing? Is the species monoecious or dioecious? How isolated is the population, and what kinds of threats may be impacting? And would your collecting impact the reproductive output or survival of that population? When populations are super sensitive and really small, use photography or other means of documentation. I actually think it's perfectly acceptable to submit photographs as herbarium specimens, especially when plants are very sensitive. And take the time to make other relevant observations. Those are really key for understanding our rare plants. Avoid collecting the same species from the same site in consecutive years. Our permit with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service indicates historical occurrences not documented in more than 5 years for annuals and herbaceous perennials, and 10 years for shrubs and trees. And you want to minimize any negative and long-term impacts, such as trampling, transporting potential competitors, predators, invasive species, and minimize your handling, and of course leave no trace. And care properly for the specimens that you collect, and don't let any material go to waste. Deposit your specimens in a recognized publicly accessible herbarium within the appropriate time frame in which you collected it. We have a backlog, you know. And include collecting permit information on specimen labels. This is becoming increasingly more common and expected of herbaria. And you want to provide regular updates, final reports, copies of publications to the relevant heritage programs, native plant societies, government agencies, and private landowners. And when you're discussing your research results, describe your conservation considerations underlying your collecting techniques. And last but not least, set an example. It's really important for us to teach others about the importance of collections and to properly and carefully collect specimens, especially those rare ones. And support your herbaria. Thank you.
Maybe time for one question. Okay.
The question of seed preservation. Do herbaria have any established protocol to assure that when they receive specimens of a rare plant and there are seeds present, they're going to collect those seeds and take specific procedures to preserve those seeds?
That is definitely a question for Evan Meyer. Whether or not collecting seeds for rare plants and how that would be preserved. In terms of if you're interested in viability, I think that seed collections like the one that Evan Mare, who is our seed collection manager, they would probably have better facilities than an herbarium would for preserving those seeds long-term. For us, we're interested in the specimens, and we obviously would have seeds on those specimens, but I think you're thinking about the preservation, and that's an entirely different collection. I was mostly referring to herbarium specimens as vouchers. So.
Thank you. No, we're at that.